Lena used to believe that the world was full of color. She saw beauty in everything. The way sunlight touched the leaves in the morning, the sound of rain on the roof, the smell of wet earth after a storm. She carried a small sketchbook everywhere she went, filling it with quick drawings of people, faces, and moments that most others didn't notice. Her dream was to become an artist. She imagined herself painting in a small studio, surrounded by canvases and the quiet hum of life outside her window. It wasn't fame she wanted, it was freedom. The kind that came from doing what she loved. But dreams have a way of colliding with reality. It began one winter afternoon. Her mother fell ill, not just a cold or flu, but something that made her too weak to leave bed. The hospital visits became frequent, and the bills grew faster than anyone could handle. Her father, who worked at a local workshop, started staying out late trying to find extra shifts. The house grew quieter, colder and smaller somehow. Lena tried to help. She took care of her younger brother, cooked meals, and studied whenever she could. But when her mother's treatment became too expensive, she knew something had to give. That night she sat at the kitchen table with her father. He looked tired, his eyes red from lack of sleep, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the medical bills over and over in his hands. "I can pause school for a while," Lena said softly, even though her voice shook. "I can work until things get better." Her father didn't answer at first. He just stared at her with a sadness she had never seen before. Then he nodded slowly, and just like that, her world changed. The next week she started working at a local factory on the edge of town. It wasn't what she had imagined for herself. Long hours, the smell of metal and oil, the same noise repeating every day. But she told herself it was only temporary, just until her mother got better. Just until her father could find a steadier job. At first, she tried to stay positive. She brought her sketchbook with her during lunch breaks, drawing quick sketches of the people around her, the tired woman who always hummed old songs, the man who joked to make others laugh, the quiet supervisor who watched everything without saying much. It helped her hold on to something real, but the weeks turned into months and the weight of responsibility grew heavier. Her mother's health didn't improve. Her father became quieter, often staring at the television with a blank expression. Her brother needed new clothes for school, and the bills kept coming. Lena began to feel like she was disappearing. Every morning, she woke before sunrise dressed in silence and walked to the bus stop in the cold. She watched other people rush by, students with backpacks, couples holding hands, mothers with children. She wondered what it felt like to live without worry, even for a day. At work, the machines drowned out every thought. The air was filled with dust and her hands became rough and blistered. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her work, counting the seconds between each sound. But sometimes she'd catch herself staring at the walls, her mind miles away. The one thing she missed most was color. Her world had become shades of gray. Concrete floors, metal walls, dull uniforms. Even her sketchbook began to gather dust at home. When she tried to draw again, nothing came out right. The lines felt stiff, lifeless, meaningless. There were nights when she sat by her mother's bedside holding her hand, pretending everything was okay. Her mother would smile faintly and whisper, "You're strong, my girl." But inside, Lena didn't feel strong at all. She felt like a shadow of the person she used to be. Sometimes she would walk to the river after work and sit there in silence. The water moved slowly, carrying bits of light from the street lamps. She used to love that place as a child. Now she sat there because it was the only place she could breathe. One evening, after another long day at the factory, she stayed on the bus a little longer than usual. She sat by the window and watched the city blur by. The world outside looked alive. People laughing, shops glowing with warm light, cars passing by. But she felt like she was behind glass, watching a life she no longer belonged to. Her reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. Her face seemed older, her eyes tired. She didn't recognize the person staring back. She whispered to herself, "Is this all my life will ever be?" No one heard her. The bus kept moving. When she got home that night, the house was dark except for the dim light in her mother's room. Her father was asleep on the couch, his arm covering his face. She went to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and stood there for a long time, staring at nothing. She remembered how her art teacher once told her, "When life gets hard, don't stop creating. That's when art matters most." But how could she create when she barely had the strength to keep going? Still, something in her refused to give up completely. She picked up her old sketchbook, the one covered in smudges and coffee stains, and opened it. The first few pages were full of laughter and color, drawings of her mother in the garden, her brother chasing the dog, the city skyline at sunset. The last few pages were empty. She took a pencil and began to draw. Not something beautiful, just a line, then another, then a shape. It was shaky and uncertain, but it was hers. For a moment it felt like breathing again. Then she heard her mother coughing from the next room. She closed the book and set it aside. Days passed the same way: work, home, worry, repeat. She barely spoke to anyone at the factory except for a few polite words. But there was one woman, an older worker named Rosa, who noticed her silence. "You remind me of myself when I was your age," Rosa said one day during lunch. "Always thinking too much. Life gets heavy sometimes, but you can't carry it all alone." Lena smiled faintly. "I don't have much of a choice." Rosa nodded knowingly. "There's always a choice, even small ones, like deciding to look up instead of down." It was a simple thing to say, but it stayed with Lena. That night she walked home, and for the first time in a while she looked up at the sky. The stars were faint behind the city lights, but they were still there. She thought of her mother's voice, her father's tired eyes, her brother's laughter, and something inside her stirred, a small, fragile spark. But the next day, everything seemed to collapse again. Her father came home early, his face pale and defeated. The workshop where he worked had closed without warning. There would be no more paychecks for now. He sat at the kitchen table, holding his head in his hands, and whispered, "I don't know what to do anymore." Lena wanted to tell him it would be okay, but she couldn't find the words. She just stood there watching the man who had always seemed strong crumble before her eyes. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the clock ticking. Each tick felt like a reminder of everything slipping away. Their home, their safety, her dreams. She felt trapped in a tunnel with no light ahead. In the early hours of the morning, she got out of bed and walked quietly to the kitchen. The house was silent. She sat at the table, resting her head on her arms, and let the tears she had been holding back finally fall. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just quiet tears that came from exhaustion, fear, and loneliness. When the first light of dawn touched the window, she wiped her face and stood up. She looked outside, the sky turning pale blue, the world slowly waking up. And though she didn't know it yet, that morning would be the beginning of everything. She didn't find hope that day, not yet. But she took one small step toward it, the simple act of standing up, getting dressed, and facing another day. Sometimes, that's where hope begins, not in miracles or grand moments, but in choosing to keep going when it would be easier to stop. Lena didn't know how her story would unfold. She only knew that even in the quiet darkness of her life, there was still something deep inside her that refused to let go completely. And that something, though small and silent, was the start of her way back to the light. The days began to blend together for Lena. She woke up before dawn, caught the same bus, sat in the same seat, and worked the same long hours at the factory. Each day felt heavier than the one before. She tried to tell herself she was doing it for her family, that it would all make sense one day, but lately, even that thought was starting to fade. Her mother's health had reached a point where the doctors spoke in careful, quiet tones. Her father spent hours searching for work, coming home with tired eyes and empty hands. The sound of laughter had left their home long ago. Lena barely spoke at work anymore. The people around her had their own worries, their own struggles. No one had time for conversation beyond a quick good morning. Even Rosa, the older woman who had once shared kind words, had taken sick leave and hadn't returned. There were times Lena wanted to scream just to hear her own voice again. One afternoon, as she was finishing a long shift, she suddenly felt dizzy. The sound of the machines grew faint, her vision blurred, and before she could steady herself, everything went black. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on a narrow bed in the small factory infirmary. The room smelled of disinfectant. A nurse leaned over her, gently touching her wrist. "You fainted," the nurse said softly. "You need rest, dear." "How long have you been working without a break?" Lena tried to answer, but her throat felt dry. She didn't even know how many days it had been since she'd last slept properly. "You should go home," the nurse added. You can't keep pushing yourself like this. Lena nodded weakly, though she knew rest wasn't really an option. She couldn't afford to miss a day's pay. That night, as she walked home, her body felt like lead. The cold air stung her face, but she hardly noticed. When she reached the house, her father was sitting at the kitchen table again, papers spread out in front of him. He looked up when she entered. "You're home late," he said. His voice sounded distant, tired. "I'm fine," she replied automatically. He studied her for a moment, then sighed. "You don't look fine, Lena." She didn't answer. She didn't want to cry. Not again. Her mother called from the next room, her voice weak but kind. "Come here, sweetheart." Lena walked into the dimly lit room and sat beside her mother's bed. Her mother reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "You've lost weight," she whispered. "I'm just tired," Lena said softly. Her mother smiled faintly. "You always say that." She paused, her breathing uneven. "You don't have to carry everything alone." Lena wanted to believe her, but she couldn't see another way. Someone had to keep things together. Someone had to be strong. The following weeks became even harder. The factory demanded longer hours, and the winter cold crept into their small home. One morning the bus was late, and she arrived to find the supervisor waiting with a scowl. "You're 5 minutes late," he said. "Don't make a habit of it." She apologized, even though it wasn't her fault. Inside, something in her began to crack. The next few days, she noticed her hands trembling more often. Simple things, pouring tea, buttoning her coat, felt strangely difficult. Her body was begging for rest, but her mind kept whispering, "Keep going." Then one night, everything came crashing down. It was a Friday. The factory was colder than usual, the air filled with the sound of clanking metal. She had been feeling dizzy all day but didn't tell anyone. She just kept working, one motion after another, trying to ignore the growing pressure in her chest. When her shift finally ended, she headed toward the locker room. But halfway there, the world seemed to tilt. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding uncontrollably. The room spun and her knees gave out. Someone shouted her name, but it was faint, like an echo underwater. Then nothing. The next thing she knew, she was waking up in a hospital bed. The smell of antiseptic filled her nose. The room was bright and quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of a monitor beside her. Her father sat by the window, his face pale with worry. When he saw her eyes open, he stood quickly. "You're awake," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "What happened?" She murmured. "You collapsed at work," he said. "The doctor says you were exhausted, dehydrated, low blood pressure, and—" He hesitated. "They said you're under too much stress." Lena turned her head away, staring at the ceiling. She felt empty. A doctor entered the room, a calm-looking man with gentle eyes. "How are you feeling, Lena?" he asked. "I'm fine," she replied automatically, though she wasn't. He gave a small, knowing smile. "That's what everyone says. But your body tells me otherwise. You've been pushing yourself too hard. You need rest, real rest." She didn't respond. She didn't know what rest even meant anymore. The doctor continued softly. "I've seen this before. Young people taking on too much. You can't help your family if you lose yourself in the process. I want you to see someone, a counselor, just to talk." Her father looked uncertain, but the doctor insisted gently. Sometimes talking helps more than medicine. For the first time in months, Lena stayed in bed for more than a few hours. The hospital room was quiet, almost too quiet. She watched the sunlight move slowly across the wall, thinking about how her life had turned into something she never planned. Her sketchbook sat on the bedside table. One of the nurses had found it in her bag. She picked it up and turned the pages, looking at her old drawings. They felt like memories from another life. That evening, her father left to check on her mother at home. The room grew dim. Lena lay awake, listening to the hum of machines, and thought about what the doctor had said. Lose yourself in the process. Was that what had happened to her? The next morning, a gentle knock came at the door. A woman in a gray sweater stepped inside, carrying a clipboard and a kind smile. "Hello, I'm from the counseling team," she said. "May I come in?" Lena nodded. The woman sat beside her bed and spoke softly, asking about her work, her family, her health. At first, Lena gave short, simple answers, but after a while, something in her broke open. She started to talk, really talk, for the first time in a long time. She talked about her mother's illness, her father's job loss, the endless hours at the factory, and the emptiness that had taken over her heart. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. The counselor listened without interrupting, only nodding now and then. When Lena finally fell silent, the woman said quietly, "You've been carrying too much pain and you never gave yourself permission to rest. You're not weak for needing help." Lena looked down, her hands gripping the blanket. "I just wanted to keep everyone together." "That's love," the counselor said softly. "But love also means caring for yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup." The words stayed with her long after the woman left. Later that evening, the nurse came in to check on her. "You look a little better," she said kindly. "You even have some color in your face." Lena smiled faintly. "Maybe." When night came, she sat up and looked out the window. The city lights shimmered in the distance. For the first time in months, she wasn't rushing anywhere or forcing herself to keep moving. She just sat there and breathed. There was something strange about being still. It was uncomfortable, but also strangely peaceful. She thought about how far she had fallen, from dreams of painting to endless days of labor. But in that quiet room, she realized she was still here, alive, tired, but still here. Before she went to sleep, she reached for her sketchbook again. Her hand trembled slightly as she opened to a blank page. She didn't draw anything fancy, just a single candle, its small flame glowing in the dark. It wasn't much, but it felt like something. The next morning, her father returned. He brought her a small thermos of soup and sat beside her. "The doctor says you'll need a few more days here," he said. She nodded. He looked at her with tired eyes but managed a small smile. "You scared me, you know." "I thought." He stopped himself. "Just promise me you'll take care of yourself." "I will," she said quietly. He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. Still, his hand rested on hers for a long moment before he stood to leave. When he was gone, Lena looked around the hospital room again. It wasn't beautiful, but it was safe, and for now that was enough. She didn't know what would happen next, how she'd face the world outside, or what she'd do when she went home. But as she closed her eyes and drifted into sleep, one thought stayed with her. Maybe it wasn't too late to find something worth holding on to. Maybe this was her pause before the climb. And somewhere deep inside, in a quiet place she had almost forgotten, a small voice whispered that hope might still exist, even if she couldn't see it yet. The hospital days passed slowly, but for the first time in a long while, Lena wasn't rushing anywhere. She had time to think, to breathe, and to simply exist. At first, she didn't know what to do with that silence. It felt heavy, almost uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being still. She was used to surviving. But as the days went by, something began to shift. Every morning, a soft light came through the small window beside her bed. She would watch the sun move across the wall, painting slow golden lines across the white sheets. She started to notice things again. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, the smell of fresh coffee from the nurse's station, the quiet laughter of other patients. It was strange how life kept moving even when she felt stuck. One afternoon, a man came into her room. He was dressed in plain clothes, not a doctor's coat, and carried a folder under his arm. He looked gentle, his eyes kind behind his glasses. "Good afternoon," he said warmly. "I'm Dr. Arjun. I run the therapy sessions here. The nurses told me you like to draw." Lena hesitated. "I used to," she said quietly. He smiled. "Used to? That sounds like something we can change." She looked down, unsure how to respond. He didn't push her. Instead, he sat in the chair near her bed and spoke in a calm voice. "We have a small group that meets twice a week. We paint, talk, share stories. You don't have to join, but it helps people who have been through a lot." She thought about it for a moment. The idea of sitting with strangers made her nervous. But there was something about his voice, steady, patient, that made her feel safe. "I'll think about it," she said softly. "Good," he replied with a gentle nod. "That's all I ask." That night, she couldn't stop thinking about what he said. She hadn't painted in months. Her sketchbook sat by her bed, untouched except for the small candle she had drawn days ago. Part of her missed it, the feeling of pencil or brush in her hand, the way time disappeared when she created something. The next day, when Dr. Arjun returned, she surprised herself by saying, "Maybe I could try one session." His smile was warm. "That's a start." The art therapy room was small but bright. Paintings covered the walls, landscapes, faces, even abstract splashes of color. There were about 6 people sitting around a large table, each with a canvas in front of them. Some smiled when Lena entered. Others were too focused on their work to notice. Dr. Arjun guided her to a seat and handed her a blank sheet of paper. "No rules here," he said. "Just paint whatever you feel." She stared at the paper for a long time. Her hands felt awkward, unfamiliar with the brush. At first, she painted soft shapes, light colors, then darker tones. Without meaning to, she began painting the river she used to sit by, the dark water, the faint reflection of lights, and a small figure sitting alone on the edge. When she stepped back and looked at it, her chest tightened. It wasn't beautiful, but it was honest. Dr. Arjun came over quietly. "That's powerful," he said. "Sometimes the things we can't say find their way out through art." Lena didn't know what to say, but for the first time in months, she felt something inside her loosen. She began attending the sessions regularly. Each time, she painted something different. Sometimes storms, sometimes faces, sometimes just colors that made no sense to anyone but her. The others in the group shared their stories too. There was an old man who painted mountains because he missed home, a young woman who used only bright colors because she said it made her forget her pain. No one judged. Everyone just created. Lena began to look forward to those afternoons. They became the one part of her week that felt alive. Outside the sessions, she started to talk more with the nurses, even sharing small jokes with them. Her body was still weak, but her spirit felt lighter. One evening, after a long session, she stayed behind to clean up her brushes. Dr. Arjun was stacking canvases when he said quietly, "You know, you have a gift." She laughed softly. "I don't know about that," he smiled. "You do. But more than that, you have a voice through your art. Don't lose it again." His words echoed in her mind long after she left the room. When she was finally discharged from the hospital, she felt nervous about going home. The thought of returning to the same routine, the same struggles, scared her. But she promised herself she would try to see things differently. Her father welcomed her home with a tired but genuine smile. "You look better," he said, touching her shoulder gently. "I feel a little better," she replied. And it was true. Her mother's condition hadn't changed much. But when Lena sat by her bedside and showed her a small painting she had done, a sunrise over a quiet field, her mother's eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "You haven't lost your touch." That moment meant more to Lena than any paycheck ever could. The next few weeks weren't easy. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. The bills still came, her father still struggled to find steady work, and some nights were still heavy with worry. But there was a difference now. She started setting aside an hour every evening for painting. Sometimes her brother joined her, making a mess of colors on old cardboard, laughing as he mixed the wrong paints together. Their small living room slowly filled with drawings and bright smudges of paint. It wasn't much, but it felt alive again. One afternoon, while she was buying groceries, she saw a notice on the community board at the store. It said, "Volunteers needed. Art activities for children at City Hospital." She stared at it for a long moment. Something inside her stirred. The same hospital where she had stayed now needed people to bring a little light to others. That evening, she told her father about it. "It's only once a week," she said. "I think I should try," he nodded. "If it makes you happy, you should." So the next week, she walked back into that hospital, this time not as a patient, but as someone ready to give something back. The children's ward was full of laughter and small voices. Some of the children were hooked to machines. Others sat in wheelchairs, but their energy filled the room like sunlight. Lena felt nervous at first, unsure how to start. But as she handed out paintbrushes and paper, one little boy grinned at her and said, "Can you draw a rocket?" She smiled. "Only if you promise to draw the moon." Soon the room was filled with colors, laughter, and paint-splattered hands. The children didn't care about perfection. They just painted because it made them happy. Watching them, Lena realized how healing it could be to create, even when life was hard. Every week after that, she went back. Sometimes she read stories to them. Sometimes she painted beside them. Each visit reminded her that hope wasn't something distant. It was something you built little by little, even in small rooms filled with laughter and paint. Dr. Arjun visited once while she was there. He watched quietly as she helped a young girl paint a butterfly. When the session ended, he walked over and said, "You found your way back, didn't you?" Lena smiled, wiping paint from her hands. "I think I'm still finding it." He nodded. That's good. Hope isn't a place, it's a path. That night, as she walked home, the sky was painted in shades of gold and pink. She stopped by the river, the same one she used to sit by when she felt lost. The water still carried reflections of light, but now she saw beauty in the movement instead of sadness. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like a shadow. She felt real, present, and alive. When she reached home, her brother was sitting on the floor drawing a big, uneven tree. "Look," he said proudly, "it's growing even in the dark." Lena froze for a moment, then smiled. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window with her sketchbook and began drawing again. Not from pain this time, but from something else. She drew the children's faces, her family, the light reflecting on the water. Each line felt like a small step forward. When she finished, she looked at the picture. It wasn't perfect, but it was filled with warmth. She realized something then. She hadn't escaped the darkness. She had learned to bring light into it, and maybe that was what hope really was, not something you find, but something you make. One small act, one kind word, one honest drawing at a time. Time passed quietly, but something had changed in Lena's life. It wasn't a big sudden change. It was small and soft, like the slow opening of a flower after a long winter. Her days still carried challenges. The bills still came, her father still worked odd jobs, and her mother's health was still fragile. But now there was light in the small moments: morning tea shared with her father, laughter from her younger brother, the gentle strokes of paint on a canvas at night. She had started volunteering at the hospital every weekend, helping children paint and draw. Those few hours became her favorite part of the week. Each child had a story. Some were shy, some were loud, some were fighting illnesses far too heavy for their small bodies. But when they painted, none of that seemed to matter. One Saturday morning, as Lena walked into the children's ward, she was greeted by familiar smiles. A little girl waved excitedly and shouted, "You came back." Lena laughed and said, "Of course I did. Who else would bring the glitter paint?" The room filled with giggles. She spread out papers, brushes, and colors on the table, and soon everyone was busy creating their own worlds: castles, trees, stars, and animals. Lena moved from child to child, helping them mix colors and draw shapes. While helping a boy paint a rainbow, she noticed a nurse watching from the doorway. It was the same nurse who had cared for her months ago when she was a patient. The nurse smiled and said softly, "You look happier now." Lena paused, then nodded. "I think I am." It felt strange saying it out loud, but it was true. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was part of something meaningful. At home, her mother's room had changed too. The once quiet space now had small paintings on the wall, drawings Lena had made with her brother. Each picture told a story: a sunrise, a river, a bird taking flight. Her mother said the colors made her feel alive. Sometimes Lena would sit by her mother's bedside and tell her stories about the children at the hospital. Her mother listened with a soft smile, as if each story added a bit of warmth to her heart. One evening, while Lena was cleaning her brushes, her mother said, "You've become the light in other people's lives." Lena looked up a little surprised. "I just help them paint." Her mother shook her head gently. "No, you help them see beauty again. That's something special." Those words stayed in her heart. A few weeks later, the hospital organized a small art exhibition for the children. The event was called Colors of Courage. The hallways were decorated with drawings and paintings made by the young patients. Lena helped hang them up, carefully labeling each one with the child's name. Parents, nurses, and doctors came to see the artwork. There was laughter, applause, and even a few tears. Some of the children were too sick to attend, but their paintings spoke louder than words. When it was almost over, Dr. Arjun approached Lena. "You've done wonderful work here," he said. She smiled. "They did most of it. I just gave them brushes." He looked at her kindly. "Maybe, but you gave them hope too. And that's rarer than paint." Lena felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say something, but all she could do was nod. After the exhibition, something unexpected happened. The hospital director asked her if she would like to continue volunteering more often, and even lead small sessions for adults recovering from emotional trauma. Lena hesitated at first. "I don't know if I can do that," she said. "I'm not a real teacher," the director smiled. "You don't need to be. You understand what it's like to feel lost. That's more than enough. So, she agreed. Soon she found herself running small evening sessions in a quiet room near the hospital garden. People came from different walks of life. An elderly man who had lost his wife, a young woman trying to recover from burnout, a man who had just lost his job. They all carried different kinds of pain, but when they sat down to paint, the walls between them seemed to fade. Lena watched as colors turned into healing. Sometimes she would sit quietly and paint alongside them. Her favorite piece during those sessions was a tree she painted over several days. It started as a dark, leafless trunk, but as time went on, she added more branches and eventually small green leaves. She called it the tree that grew in the dark. When she finished it, she didn't plan to keep it for herself. She decided to hang it in the hospital hallway, hoping it might remind someone else that growth could still happen, even in difficult places. One day, as she was leaving the hospital, she got a call from her father. His voice was quiet but calm. "Your mother's having a bad day," he said. Lena rushed home immediately. When she entered the room, her mother was lying in bed, breathing weakly. Her brother sat beside her, holding her hand. Lena's heart sank. She sat down and whispered, "I'm here, Mom." Her mother smiled faintly. "I know you are." They talked softly for a while about the paintings, the children, the sunlight outside the window. Her mother's voice grew weaker with each word. At one point, she whispered, "Promise me something." Lena leaned closer. "Anything. Promise me you'll keep painting, no matter what happens. Promise me you'll live the life you dreamed of." Tears filled Lena's eyes. She nodded. "I promise." Her mother smiled one last time, her eyes filled with warmth and peace. "Good," she whispered. That night the house was silent. Lena sat by the window holding her sketchbook in her lap. She didn't cry loudly. The tears came quietly, falling like rain against the pages of her drawings. The next morning felt strange, too quiet, too empty. But as sunlight entered the room, it fell across the wall where her mother's favorite painting hung, the one with the sunrise. Lena walked to it, touched the edge of the frame and whispered, "I'll keep my promise." Days turned into weeks. The pain didn't disappear, but it softened. Instead of breaking her, it became something she carried gently, like a reminder of love that never left. She went back to the hospital soon after. The staff welcomed her with kind smiles, but she noticed something new. People seemed to look to her not just as a volunteer, but as someone who carried hope. One afternoon, while cleaning the art room, she found one of her mother's old scarves in her bag. She hadn't realized she had packed it by mistake. She smiled and tied it around her neck before starting the next class. It made her feel close to her mother again. That day she painted with the group. She didn't plan what to draw, she just let the brush move. When she finished, she looked at the canvas and saw a field of light, a single tree in the center, and a woman standing under it, looking toward the sky. She titled it, "For Her." When she stepped back and looked at it, a sense of peace washed over her. The others in the room gathered around to see. One of them said softly, "It looks like hope." Lena smiled. "It is." Later that evening, as she walked home, the city lights shimmered around her. She passed the river where she used to sit when she felt lost. The water moved gently, carrying small reflections of the moon. She remembered that night long ago when she had whispered to her reflection, asking if this was all her life would ever be. She smiled faintly at the memory. The answer, she realized now, had changed completely. Her life wasn't perfect. It still had pain, struggles, and uncertainty, but it also had meaning. It had connection. It had color. She thought about all the people who had helped her along the way, Dr. Arjun, the children, her family, and realized something important. Hope wasn't something that appeared suddenly. It grew slowly like her painted tree, branch by branch, leaf by leaf. That night she hung her new painting above her bed. She sat for a long time, staring at it, the soft glow of the streetlight touching the colors. For the first time in a long while, she felt her heart settle, not because everything was fixed, but because she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. And somewhere deep inside, she could almost hear her mother's voice again, soft and proud, whispering, "You found it." Lena smiled through her tears and whispered back, "Yes, I found hope." Lena's life began to move at a different rhythm after her mother's passing. Days didn't rush by anymore. They seemed to walk slowly beside her. She learned to live with the silence that filled their small house. At first it was unbearable. Every sound reminded her of her mother, the clinking of cups, the rustle of curtains, even the soft hum of the evening breeze. But slowly, the silence became softer. It wasn't empty anymore. It was gentle, almost comforting, like her mother's memory sitting quietly in the corners of every room. Lena kept her promise. She continued volunteering at the hospital, painting with children and guiding small art groups. She wasn't just helping others. She was healing herself in the process. Every brushstroke, every smile from a patient, every painting pinned to the wall gave her a reason to keep going. The hospital had become her second home. The staff knew her by name, and the children called her Miss Paint. She carried a small bag filled with colors, brushes, and tiny pieces of paper, where she wrote short, encouraging notes for the kids. Each week she'd slip one into someone's drawing folder. Small messages like, "You are stronger than you think," or "Your colors matter." Those words didn't just help the children. They reminded her of what she had learned too. One afternoon, while preparing for a new session, a nurse walked in carrying a stack of papers. "Lena," she said with a smile, "the hospital board saw your work with the kids. They're planning an art event for charity next month. They want you to help organize it." Lena blinked in surprise. "Me?" "Yes, you. You've been the heart of this program. They trust you." The thought scared her a little. She had never led anything so big before. But then she thought of her mother's words. "Promise me you'll live the life you dreamed of." She smiled. "I'll do it." The next few weeks were filled with planning. She worked with nurses, volunteers, and even some of the older patients who wanted to help. They gathered paintings from children, staff, and community members, all representing stories of strength and recovery. The theme was simple: light after darkness. As the day of the exhibition approached, the hospital corridors buzzed with energy. Lena often stayed late, hanging artwork, writing name tags, and arranging decorations. One evening, as she was adjusting a painting, Dr. Arjun stopped by. "You've done something incredible here," he said, looking around the hall filled with color and life. Lena smiled, brushing paint off her hands. "It doesn't feel real sometimes," he nodded. "That's what happens when you pour your heart into something. It becomes larger than you." His words stayed with her. The night before the event, Lena stood alone in the decorated hall. The lights were dim, but the walls shone with stories. 100 pieces of hope, each painted by someone who had faced pain and chosen to create beauty instead. She walked along the rows slowly, stopping at a small painting by one of the youngest patients, a little girl named Ria. The painting showed a tiny seed under dark soil, with a single green sprout pushing upward. Beneath it, the girl had written, "Because the dark makes me grow." Lena touched the edge of the frame gently. That single line felt like her own story. The next morning, the event began. Families, hospital staff, and people from the town filled the hall. There was laughter, applause, and even a few quiet tears as visitors stopped to read the stories behind the paintings. When it was time for the short speech, the hospital director called Lena forward. She wasn't expecting it, but everyone clapped until she stepped onto the small stage. Her hands trembled slightly, but when she looked around the room at the children smiling, at the doctors and nurses who believed in her, the fear faded. She took a deep breath and said, "A few months ago, I was one of the people sitting in those hospital beds, wondering if life had any color left in it. I thought I had lost everything, but then someone handed me a paintbrush, and that simple act reminded me that we can create light even in dark times. Every painting in this room is proof that we're all still growing, even when it hurts. Hope isn't something we find, it's something we make." When she stepped down, people hugged her, some crying, some smiling. The moment felt unreal, but also deeply right. Later that evening, after everyone had left, Lena returned to the empty hall. The soft hum of the lights filled the space. She walked up to her own painting, the tree that grew in the dark. She touched the canvas lightly. Thinking of her mother, she whispered, "I did it, Mom." For the first time in a long while, she felt peace. Not the absence of pain, but a gentle stillness that came after it. A few days later, the hospital director called her to the office. He told her the event had raised enough money to expand the art program permanently. They wanted her to become the coordinator. Lena's eyes widened. Are you sure? He smiled. You're already doing the work. This just makes it official. She accepted, her heart full of gratitude. Life began to take new shape. She still faced challenges. Her father's health sometimes worried her, and money was still tight. But her days now had purpose. She woke each morning with a quiet sense of direction, knowing her work mattered. One afternoon, while walking through the hospital garden, she saw a group of children sitting under a large tree painting together. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, landing in soft patches on their papers. She stood watching for a long time, smiling to herself. Dr. Arjun joined her, carrying a small cup of tea. They remind me of you, he said. Lena laughed softly. I used to be one of them. He nodded. You still are. That's why they trust you. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the children's laughter. Then he said, You've found your place, haven't you? She looked around at the trees, the hospital windows, the children with their bright colors, and nodded. Yes, I think I have. That evening, Lena returned home and found her father sitting on the porch. He looked up and smiled. You're home late. I was helping clean up after the art class, she said, sitting beside him. He nodded slowly, then added, Your mother would be proud of you. Lena's eyes softened. I hope so. She would, he said firmly. You brought light back into this house. They sat quietly together as the sky turned orange and then blue. For the first time in years, the air around their home felt peaceful again. That night, Lena took out a blank canvas. She hadn't painted for herself in a while. Not for work, not for the hospital, but just for her. She thought about everything she had lived through. The pain, the exhaustion, the healing, the love that stayed. She began painting slowly, without thinking. When she was done, she looked at it and saw a path leading through a dark forest, with light shining softly at the end. The path wasn't straight or easy, but it was there, clear and steady. She smiled. It felt right. Before going to bed, she wrote a small note and taped it to the bottom of the painting. It said, For everyone walking through darkness, keep moving. The light is waiting. The next morning, she brought the painting to the hospital and hung it in the lobby where everyone could see it. People stopped to read the note, some smiling, some standing silently for a while. That was how Lena wanted her art to live, not in galleries or books, but in real places, among real people who needed a reminder that hope still existed. Weeks turned into months. The art program grew bigger. She began teaching local workshops and even visiting nearby schools. She told her story when asked, not with sadness, but with gratitude. And every time she spoke about her journey, she ended the same way. Even when life feels dark, there is always a way to bring back the light. You don't have to find it somewhere else. You can create it. Her voice always carried calm strength when she said those words. People listened and something in them softened, the same way she once did when someone gave her hope. That night, when Lena returned home and stood by her window, she looked up at the stars. The city lights glowed faintly below, and for a moment she felt the world breathe with her. Her story wasn't over. It was still being painted one day at a time. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by memories, color, and peace, she finally understood what her mother had meant. Hope doesn't always shine brightly. Sometimes it flickers gently, like a candle in a dark room. Fragile, but enough to guide you home. Lena smiled, placed her paintbrush on the table, and whispered, Thank you. Time moved forward softly as it always does. Seasons changed, leaves turned gold and fell and then grew green again. The hospital art room became brighter with every passing month. New faces came in, and familiar ones returned just to say thank you. Lena had built something lasting, something that had grown from pain but now bloomed with love. She often thought about how strange life was, how a single act of courage could change so much. What once began as her own search for light had turned into a lantern for others. Each morning she arrived early, opened the curtains, and looked out at the garden before classes began. The sunlight spilling across the tables filled her with quiet gratitude. She had stopped waiting for happiness to arrive. She had learned to create it. One morning, the hospital director told her that the art program had received a small grant. They wanted to expand it into a community center nearby, a place where anyone, not just patients, could come to heal through creativity. Lena felt a rush of emotion. A center? She asked, hardly believing it. Yes, he said. We want you to lead it. It will carry the same name as your first exhibition, Light from the Shadows. She stood silent for a few moments. Her eyes filled with tears, but her smile stayed gentle. I'd be honored. The months that followed were filled with new beginnings. The old building chosen for the center was dusty and forgotten, but Lena saw possibility in every corner. With help from volunteers, families, and friends, they painted the walls, cleaned the floors, and filled the rooms with canvases, brushes, and colors. It wasn't just a place for art, it became a space for stories. People came with their hearts full of emotion, some broken, some hopeful. There were widows who painted sunsets for the partners they had lost. Teenagers who used color to express what they couldn't say in words. Children who painted the future they wanted to believe in. Lena walked among them, guiding gently, never forcing, always listening. She knew from experience that healing couldn't be rushed. It had its own timing. One afternoon, an elderly man came to the center. His hands trembled slightly as he held a paintbrush. He said quietly, "I haven't painted since my wife passed away 20 years ago." Lena smiled softly. "Then maybe today's the right day to start again." He sat down and began painting slowly. At first his strokes were unsure, but as the hours passed, color began to return to his canvas, and perhaps to his heart as well. When he finished, he looked at Lena with tearful eyes and whispered, "I feel like I just spoke to her again." Moments like that reminded Lena why she had chosen this path. Word about the center spread quickly. Local schools sent students for workshops. Therapists partnered with the program. Even the mayor visited once, praising how art had brought hope to so many. Despite all the success, Lena stayed humble. She still worked quietly, still carried her mother's scarf tied to her bag, and still visited the hospital every week to check on her old art room. One day she received a letter in the mail. It was from a publishing company. They had seen a short article about her story and wanted to help her create a book, part memoir, part guide, to inspire others. At first, Lena hesitated. She wasn't sure her words were enough. She wasn't famous, she wasn't a trained writer, but the editor wrote, "People don't need perfect words. They need honest ones." That sentence convinced her to say yes. For months, she wrote in the evenings, sitting by her window with a cup of tea. She wrote about her mother, her time in the hospital, her students, the children, the paintings that changed her life. She didn't hide her struggles or her fears. She wrote everything truthfully because she wanted readers to feel less alone. When the book was finally published, it was simple, small, and filled with real stories, the kind that made people pause and breathe. It wasn't a bestseller, but it reached hearts. Letters began arriving from people she had never met, from cities and countries far away. One message said, "Your story stopped me from giving up," another said, "I never knew art could heal me until I read your words." Each letter felt like a soft echo of her own past. People walking through the same darkness she once knew, now finding their own light. Years went by. The art center became part of the town's heartbeat. Children who once painted under her care grew up and returned as volunteers. The old tree in the hospital garden, once small, now spread wide branches over the yard, offering shade to everyone who passed beneath it. One afternoon, Lena sat under that tree with Dr. Arjun, who had long since retired but still visited sometimes. They shared tea just as they used to after therapy sessions years ago. He smiled at her and said, "Do you remember when you couldn't even say the word hope without crying?" She laughed softly. "Yes. I remember thinking it was something other people found, not me." He nodded, looking out at the garden. "And now look what you've done. You didn't just find it, you built it so others could find it too." She smiled, her eyes warm. "Maybe that's how hope really works. You pass it on." The evening sun filtered through the leaves, painting the ground with gold. They sat in silence for a while, content. That night, Lena returned home and stood by her window. She looked at the town lights flickering in the distance. Somewhere out there, someone was probably sitting alone, wondering if things would ever get better, just as she once had. She whispered into the quiet air, "You will. You just have to keep going." The next morning, she went to the art center early. It was quiet, filled with soft morning light. She walked through each room, touching the walls gently, feeling proud but peaceful. In one corner, a young girl was painting alone. She looked up shyly and said, "Miss, how do you make something look happy when you're not feeling happy?" Lena smiled, sitting beside her. You don't have to feel happy to paint something beautiful. Sometimes the most beautiful things come from sadness. You just have to start. The colors will do the rest, the girl nodded, dipped her brush in yellow paint and began. Lena watched her for a moment, remembering herself at that age. The loneliness, the confusion, the quiet wish for something more. She realized how far that young version of her had come.